Hello and welcome to Camp in 7 Slides, Episode 2. My name is Gilbert Piltz, and today we're going to be talking about the changes that occurred to Camp between now and Episode 1. To recap, Camp is a specification for managing applications in a platform as a service environment. It defines a YAML domain-specific language that describes an application. This YAML file can be put into a package, and that package can be deployed upon any CAMP-compliant platform. Once deployed, the application is represented using a JSON resource model, and that JSON resource model can be manipulated with a RESTful API. CAMP is being developed within Oasis as an open standard, and I've listed some of the members of the CAMP TC here in alphabetical order. Public reviews are an Oasis process by which a technical committee can solicit input from the public at large, people interested in the spec but who may not be participating in the TC. CAMP had its first public review back in 2013, and based upon the comments that the TC received in that public review, we changed a number of things and produced Public Review 2 in February of 2014. One of the items we received a good deal of feedback on was that our resource model was overly complicated. In front of us here is a UML diagram of the resource model as it existed in PR1. In addition to the main resources, which are the platform, the assembly, application component, you also see a lot of template resources, you'll see capability resources, requirement resources, and it turns out that this was all over-designed. It wasn't really necessary to accomplish the main use cases that we had set out to address. So to fix this, we engaged in a process that we sometimes refer to as the Great Refactoring, in which we got rid of the assembly template and instead renamed it and repurposed it to be a resource representation of the YAML domain-specific language that was used to describe the application in the first place. So you use this YAML file to describe your application. When you deploy the application, it turns into a plan resource. Because of the similarities between JSON and YAML, this is relatively easy to do, and it allows you to work with the plan, change the plan, and alter the plan using our RESTful API. The next thing we got rid of was platform component. There was a split between application components and platform components that turned out to be not really useful or necessary, and so we simply went with a single component resource. Capabilities are gone, requirements are gone. Platform component templates were repurposed as service resources. A service resource represents the platform provider's ability to create an instance of a service for use by an application. So for example, as a platform provider, I might want to create 3 different services that might represent the 3 different kinds of database I might be able to create for you. Or I might have a service instance that represents my ability to instantiate a particular message queue. Application capabilities, application component requirements are gone. And as I said earlier, we merged platform components and application components into a single component resource. And then we got rid of the notion of application component templates. Another item that the TC received feedback on in PR1 was the process by which you deploy an application onto a CAMP platform. Here we see the PR1 and PR2 flows. Now in the PR1 flow, what you did was to post your package, your PDP as we call it, to the platform resource. And in the success case, this would cause an assembly template resource to be created. You would then post to this assembly template resource, and if that was successful, your application was deployed. It was pointed out to us in the PR1 comments that nobody does things this way. Having to post twice to create an application is a bit silly. So we changed things around, and in PR2 we follow the much more normal and rational flow, where instead of posting to the platform resource, you actually post your PDP to an assemblies resource. An assemblies resource is a collection resource that records all of the deployed applications on this particular platform, or all the applications that this particular user has visibility to. And by posting to this assemblies resource, In the success case, your application is deployed and a new assembly is created. The other major change that occurred in PR2 dealt with the notion of resource type inheritance. This wasn't really from any feedback we received in PR1, but sort of work we had had on the table and we knew that we had to do. Every resource in CAMP has a type that defines its attributes and semantics. So once I know, for instance, that I am dealing with a assembly type, for instance, I know what the required attributes are, I know what the optional attributes are, I know that a particular attribute can be a Boolean, I know a particular attribute can be a string, that sort of thing. If we want CAMP to be extensible, and we do, it's important that you be able to define, you being a platform provider, platform providers define resources that inherit from existing CAMP resources. So, for example, the component resource that CAMP defines represents a component of a running application. It's fairly abstract in that it could represent any component, but obviously as a provider I might want to define some sort of database instance component that it's a component, but obviously it represents a database, and so in addition to inheriting all the attributes of a component, it defines its own attributes, such as what is my endpoint, what kind of database engine am I using, what is the master username, master password of this particular instance. And so in PR2 we defined a resource model in which all CAMP resources inherit directly or indirectly from this base CAMP resource. So that defines the type of the resource, the URI of the resource, its name, its string description, and an array of tags. And then on top of that, CAMP defines a number of other resources such as component, assembly, service, some of the resources I discussed in earlier slides. And then CAMP allows you to define a resource such as a DB instance that can then inherit from component. CAMP also allows for the notion of multiple inheritance, so I can have a resource type which inherits from multiple other resource types. And this seems to be, as far as we're concerned, fairly flexible and straightforward. So where do we sit right now? CAMP 1.1 is for all intents and purposes finished at this point. The technical committee doesn't anticipate making any major changes, and we're simply waiting for the requisite number of implementations to move on to the later stages of the OASIS process. But as I described in the first episode of CAMP in 7 slides, CAMP recognizes that we don't know what we don't know. And so we have left a number of things unfinished with the understanding that once CAMP gets some implementation experience, we'll have a much better idea about how to do these things, and therefore a much better chance of specifying something workable and something that works for everybody. So this slide basically presents a number of these issues, and I've broken them down into a few categories. There's a couple of API issues, one of them dealing with asynchronous operations. Obviously, if you're working with a platform as a service and you're thinking about deploying a complicated application, it's likely that you're not going to be able to start the application in the amount of time that you can reasonably wait for an HTTP response. And so therefore we're in the realm of asynchronous operations. How do I start something going and then either receive a notification of its completion and its status, or perhaps poll for how it's going, get some idea of its status? So we need to support that. And the other API issue is around collections. CAMP defines a number of collections, including a collection of all the assemblies within the platform, all the components within an assembly, all the services that are offered by a particular platform. And it's very likely that these collections will grow too large to be realistically returned in the response body of a single HTTP request. And so we have to have some way of paging through these collections and getting a view of them in chunks. There's some enhancements that are being contemplated post CAMP 1.1. One of these enhancements has to deal with the notion of describing an application by composing multiple plans. Right now in Camp 1.1, a plan is a single file, and everything that describes an application has to be in that one file. But we want to get to the point where we can reuse some of these plan files and describe an application by using parts of multiple plan files and pulling them together, importing one into another and referencing it and so forth. The other enhancement that we're thinking about right now is doing a better job of defining application export semantics. So far, Camp 1.1 has concentrated mainly on how to define a interoperable means of allowing a consumer to deploy the same application on multiple camp platform providers and achieve roughly the same result. And so we've been looking at interoperability from a application deployment perspective. But obviously, as a consumer, if you're going to move from one platform to another, you want to make sure that the platform that you're working with will allow you to export all of the data and metadata that describes that application in a way that makes it easy for you to then deploy it on another platform. And so we recognize that we need to do a more thorough job of defining application export semantics. And finally, the most difficult of all is this notion of common artifact requirement and characteristics types. As I described in episode 1, CAMP defines a framework for specifying artifacts that make up an application, but CAMP doesn't specify a canonical representation of, for instance, a Java WAR file, right? And similarly, CAMP has a framework for describing a requirement. So I can say that this particular artifact requires this particular service, but again, we don't define any canonical requirements, nor do we define any canonical services. And again, this is because we feel that at this point in time, we don't know what we don't know. If we were to attempt to do this, not only would it take a very long period of time to nail down, these common types, but that we stand a very good chance of probably getting it wrong. And so our best bet right now is to finish up Camp 1.1, have it be implemented, see what extensions, because we recognize that it's probably not possible to do a vanilla Camp 1.1 implementation and have it be useful. See what sort of extensions these implementers have implemented, the platforms have implemented to actually make this work, and then go back to the drawing board and work on Camp 1.2 with the benefit of the experience of having had those implementations. So the last slide here is a set of links to some resources. There's a link to the OASIS Camp Technical Committee. If you're interested in this work, if you've got something important to say, we urge you to join the committee. There's a link to the latest draft, the PR2 draft of the CAMP specification. And finally, in the realm of shameless self-promotion, there's a link to the proof of concept implementation that I've been working on for Camp 1.1. And with that, I thank you for your time, and I thank you for your attention.